I can still see that morning as if it's been branded into my memory. The light in March was thin and hesitant, leaking through the faded curtains in my living room, laying pale stripes across the wooden floorboards. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, hands trembling a little from the arthritis that had been my unwelcome companion for years. Yet the smell still transported me back to when mornings felt like promises. For almost 3 decades, this house had been more than shelter. It had been the stage for every joy and heartbreak of my life. The armchair by the window where my late wife used to curl up with a book before she passed 8 years ago. The long dining table where my kids did their homework while I helped them with math problems, pretending to be annoyed when they spilled milk. Every wall held a story. Every creak in the floor had a voice. I had built this life. I had kept it standing. And that morning, my children walked in and told me, very politely, that it was time for me to leave it. "Dad," Matthew started, his voice smooth and careful like he'd rehearsed it in the car, "Emily and I have been talking. We think it's time you moved into a nursing home. They can take care of you around the clock. It'll be easier for you." I blinked at him over the rim of my mug. Easier for me or easier for you? I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I turned to Emily, who was staring at her phone as if it held the script to her part in this conversation. I wasn't bedridden. I wasn't forgetful. My blood pressure was high, sure, and my knees ached when it rained, but I could still cook my own meals, drive myself to the grocery store, mow the lawn on a good day. I wasn't the kind of man who needed someone to feed him or bathe him. "Why now?" I asked, my voice slower than usual. "I'm doing fine." Matthew smiled, a reassuring smile that somehow felt cold. "You're fine, but we just want to make sure you're safe. And you know we're both so busy. At the home, they'll make sure you get everything you need." Through the window, I could see the daffodils pushing up through the dirt in the front yard, stubborn as old memories. Every spring, I planted them myself. This year, I knew I might not be here to see them bloom. Emily chimed in, "We've found a really nice place. Private room, TV, a garden view, you'll like it." I nodded slowly, pretending to consider it, but in my chest something sank. I thought of all the bills I paid every month, utilities for this house, property taxes, insurance for Matthew's car, even some of Emily's credit card debt. I had never considered stopping. It was what fathers did. Yet here they were, asking me to leave the home I had built while still living in it themselves. If you've ever felt like your place in your family was being quietly erased, you'll understand the silence that fell inside me then. And if you're hearing this, maybe you'll click like or subscribe, not for me, but because maybe someone you love needs to hear that their worth doesn't expire. I didn't argue, not that day. Maybe I wanted to believe this was just a clumsy way of showing love, or maybe I wanted to see what would happen if I stepped away, whether they would notice the gap I left behind. A week later, I packed a small suitcase, a few clothes, some family photographs, and my father's old pocket watch, the only thing of his I still owned. Matthew drove me to the facility in his sedan, Emily in the backseat scrolling through her phone. They told me about the amenities, the activities calendar. Matthew even joked, "It'll be like college for seniors." The place was clean, I'll give them that. My room had a window overlooking a neatly trimmed garden. There was a faint smell of disinfectant mixed with new furniture. But the garden here was different. It was orderly, sterile, without the wild charm of my yard. No uneven rows, no flowers growing a little too close to the fence, no history buried under the soil. That night I lay on the narrow bed staring at the plain white ceiling. I thought of the house, my house, now without me in it. No one to make coffee at dawn, no one to hum to the radio while fixing a leaky faucet. It wasn't just that I'd left the house. It was that the house had left me. The next morning, I found myself in the dining hall, surrounded by strangers who moved with slow, careful steps. Some had eyes that wandered without landing on anything, others clutched photographs like lifelines. A nurse brought me oatmeal and a cup of orange juice. I thought about the bills that would still go out from my account at the end of the month. Electricity, water, internet for a house I no longer lived in. My children wouldn't have to worry about a thing. And maybe that was the point. When Matthew called that evening, the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Emily texted me a picture of her cat. "No, how was your day, Dad? No, are you settling in okay?" Just logistics. The silence between those moments stretched longer each day. And deep inside, though I didn't want to admit it yet, I began to feel something I hadn't felt toward my children before. A question that hovered like a shadow. What am I to them now, father or bank account? I didn't know then how far the answer would push me. Packing up my life took less than an afternoon. That fact alone should have told me something. In the corner of my bedroom, I set out an old duffel bag, navy blue, frayed at the edges from a fishing trip decades ago. I took only what I thought I might need: 2 sweaters, a couple pairs of slacks, some shirts, socks, underwear. I left behind most of my shoes. There's no real reason to have more than one pair when you're not going anywhere. On my dresser sat the picture frames that had followed me through the years. I picked them up one by one. Matthew, age 5, wearing a paper crown from his kindergarten play, smiling so wide his front teeth were missing. Emily, age 3, covered in chocolate ice cream on the 4th of July, the fireworks just beginning behind her. I could remember exactly how she squealed when the sky lit up. I'd been a single father for most of their teen years after their mother's passing. I cooked dinners, drove them to soccer practice, attended every school conference even when I had to leave work early and face the boss's disapproval. I thought that mattered. I thought it counted for something. As I slid the photographs into my bag, I told myself they still loved me, that this decision to send me away wasn't about wanting me gone, but about convenience. That word lingered. The morning we left, the house was quiet. No television humming, no dishwasher running. I took one last walk through it, my hand brushing the wall of the hallway where we'd marked the kids' heights in pencil. Faint lines, names, and dates were still there. Matt 42, 96, M 310, 98. I traced over the grooves lightly as if that might make them deeper, more permanent. Matthew was waiting in the driveway, leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone. "You ready, Dad?" he asked without looking up. Emily arrived a few minutes later, coffee in hand, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. "We'll help you get settled," she said, her tone brisk, like we were moving me into a hotel for the weekend. The ride was mostly quiet. The highway stretched out gray and endless, the winter trees still bare. I watched the familiar landmarks pass: the gas station where Matt learned to pump his first gallon, the bakery where Emily and I used to get muffins after Sunday church. Neither of them noticed. At one point, Matthew said, "You'll like it there, Dad. No more worrying about grocery shopping or bills or all that stuff." I almost told him I liked grocery shopping, that bills were just part of living, that independence was worth more than convenience. But I bit my tongue. When we pulled into the facility's parking lot, the building loomed larger than I'd expected. Brick walls, clean white trim, neatly kept hedges. It looked pleasant enough, like the kind of place people in brochures smile about. But I could feel the difference. This was not a home. It was a place designed to keep people comfortable while their lives slowly shrank inside its walls. Inside, the receptionist greeted us warmly, her smile quick and practiced. Matthew filled out paperwork while Emily fussed with my bag. A nurse named Linda showed me to my room, a small but tidy space with a single bed, a dresser, a TV on the wall, and that window with the garden view. "You've got the best room in the wing," she said, pulling open the curtains. I nodded politely, but my eyes went to the sterile garden below. Perfectly symmetrical hedges, gravel paths without a stray leaf, flower beds arranged like they were afraid to step out of line. Nature, but only if it obeyed. After Matthew and Emily left, I stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with my hands. The air felt heavier without them, but not in the way you'd miss someone. It was the heaviness of being alone in a place you didn't choose. That first night, I lay in bed and thought about the conversation we hadn't had. The one where I asked them why they really wanted me here. The one where I told them I still paid for the roof over their heads. The one where I reminded them that I wasn't dead yet, but I stayed silent. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Maybe I already knew it. The days began to form a pattern. Breakfast at 8, served in a dining hall where the clink of silverware was the loudest sound. Nurses making rounds. Residents shuffling from chair to chair. The TV in the lounge playing game shows from a decade ago. Matthew called once every few days. Quick updates about work. Emily texted pictures of her cat more often than pictures of herself. They were polite, even cheerful, but there was a distance in their voices that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, I overheard two nurses talking near the doorway. That new guy still paying his kids' bills, one of them whispered, "Must be nice for them." The words slid under my skin like splinters. They weren't wrong, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if I stopped. That thought stayed with me, quiet but persistent, as I sat by my window watching the garden below. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first crack in the wall I had built to excuse their choices. And once it cracked, there was no way to stop it from breaking wide open. The first full day in the nursing home felt like walking into a painting where the colors had been drained away. Everything was beige, white, or a shade of gray that had no name. The walls were so clean they almost glared back at you. The hallways so polished you could see a faint reflection of yourself as you passed, an older man moving slower than he remembered. Mornings here began with the smell of oatmeal and the distant rumble of a laundry cart. At 8 o'clock sharp, a nurse came in with a clipboard, took my blood pressure, asked about my sleep, and wrote something down without much expression. It wasn't unkindness, just routine. And routine, I was starting to realize, was the currency here. The dining hall was already buzzing when I arrived for breakfast. I took a tray of oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and weak coffee, scanning the room for an empty table. Before I could sit, a woman with neatly curled white hair waved me over. "You're new," she said. "I'm Margaret." Her voice had a spark to it, the kind that made you think she had stories tucked away for rainy days. She introduced me to the two other people at the table: Earl, a retired bus driver with a slow smile, and Ruth, who spoke softly but had sharp eyes that missed nothing. We talked. Well, they talked about the weather, about a bingo game that had gotten unusually competitive last week, about a nurse who'd been here longer than God himself. I smiled where appropriate, nodding as if I belonged. It wasn't bad, not really, but it wasn't mine. After breakfast, I wandered the corridors, learning the layout. A lounge with a TV always tuned to game shows, a small library with large print books, a sunroom where residents sat in wheelchairs facing the glass, watching the outside world as if it were another country. The hours stretched. At home, I would have been fixing something, tightening a loose cabinet hinge, trimming the bushes, sorting through the garage. Here there was nothing to fix, nothing to tend to. The staff saw to everything. I was simply here. At night the quiet was heavy. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you get after a long day's work. It was the quiet of absence, of things left unsaid. My room was comfortable enough, but the bed felt too small, the air too still. Sometimes I'd take out the old pocket watch and run my fingers over the worn engraving on the back. My father had given it to me the day I bought my first house. "A man needs a place to stand," he told me. Lying there under the white ceiling, I couldn't help but think, where exactly was I standing now? Matthew and Emily visited on Sunday. They brought muffins from the bakery I loved, but neither stayed long. Emily had a brunch to get to, Matthew a meeting he couldn't be late for. We sat in the lounge making small talk that felt smaller by the minute. When they left, Margaret came by my room. "You'll get used to it," she said. I smiled but didn't answer. I wasn't sure if I wanted to get used to it. That afternoon, Margaret stopped by my table again during lunch. "You don't talk much," she said, stabbing a piece of overcooked carrot with her fork. "That's fine. Some people here talk too much, but you'll learn we all got here with a story." I wasn't sure I wanted to share mine, but I listened as she told hers. She'd been a nurse for 40 years, married twice, widowed once, divorced once. "The second time was my choice," she said with a half smile. "Man thought I was going to cook his meals for the rest of my life. I told him I'd rather make my own mistakes." Earl chimed in between bites of meatloaf, his voice slow and deliberate. He used to drive city buses. Knew every street in town, every shortcut. I liked seeing people, he said. But you get older and folks stop looking at you. You just become the thing between them and where they are going. Ruth didn't speak much, but later that day I found her in the sunroom, her thin fingers tracing the rim of a teacup. I used to paint, she said quietly when I sat beside her. Landscapes mostly, but my hands shake now, so I watch the sky instead. She smiled faintly as if she were painting it in her mind. These were good people, people with lives, with histories, but there was a sadness that hung over them like a veil. They had all been brought here, some by choice, others because choice had been taken from them. That night I couldn't sleep. The hallway light seeped in under my door, and every so often I heard the squeak of rubber soles on the linoleum floor. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my mind wandering to the house. In my head I walked through each room, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the sound of Emily's laughter in the hallway, the creak in the third step of the staircase, always the same note, like a piano key you can't unhear. I wondered if Matthew and Emily were in the living room now, maybe watching TV, maybe arguing about something small and forgettable. I wondered if they ever thought about me. Around 2 a.m., I got up and went to the lounge. A young aide was wiping down tables. She looked up and smiled. "Can't sleep." "Not tonight," I said. She shrugged. "Happens a lot. New place, different bed. Takes a while to settle in." Then, almost casually, she added, "I don't know why some families bring folks here when they're still so independent. You look like you could run laps around this place." It was meant as a compliment, I think, but it landed differently. It was the first time someone had voiced the thought that had been scratching at the back of my mind since I arrived. Why was I here? I didn't answer her, just nodded, thanked her for keeping the place clean, and went back to my room. But her words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet. In the morning, Margaret found me at breakfast and handed me a crossword puzzle. "Keeps your mind sharp," she said. I smiled, but my mind wasn't on the puzzle. It was somewhere else, back in the house I'd built, in the life I'd lived, and in the uneasy space between trust and suspicion. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But deep down, a small voice had already started whispering, "Something isn't right." And that voice wasn't going away. The phone on my nightstand had become an hourglass. Not because I was counting down the hours between calls, but because each conversation seemed to spill away faster than the one before it. In that first week, Matthew called every other day. His voice came through the tiny speaker, warm and casual, telling me about his meetings, about the dog chewing up a shoe, about some new restaurant he and Emily wanted to try once things settled down. The conversations lasted 5, sometimes 10 minutes. I told myself it was enough. By the second week, the calls came twice a week and were shorter, 2, maybe 3 minutes. "Hey Dad, just checking in. Everything good? Great. Gotta run." By the end of the month, they came once a week, if that, always rushed, always ending with some version of "we'll come by soon." Emily's voice was a rarer sound. She preferred to text pictures of her cat, a latte with foam shaped like a heart, a shot of her new nail polish. Things she could send without having to ask how I was or listen to my answer. Sometimes I replied, sometimes I didn't. She never seemed to notice either way. It was Margaret who noticed. We were in the sunroom one afternoon, the winter light spilling across the floor like pale silk. Earl was snoring softly in his chair, his mouth slightly open. Margaret was knitting something in a shade of blue that reminded me of the sky before rain. "You've got that look," she said without glancing up from her work. "What look?" I asked. "The one where you're listening for a phone that isn't ringing." I chuckled lightly. "Guess I'm still getting used to the quiet." She shook her head. "Don't get too used to it. That's how people disappear here. Not all at once, piece by piece. First the visits slow down, then the calls. Then one day you realize you've been holding your breath for months." I didn't tell her that I was already halfway there. That night after dinner, I sat in my room flipping through the channels on the small TV. Game shows, reruns, news that didn't feel like news. Every voice sounded too loud and too far away at the same time. I turned it off and sat there, listening instead to the hum of the heating vents, the distant clatter of dishes being washed, the squeak of the med cart wheels as it rolled down the hallway. At 8:02, the phone rang. "Matthew, hey Dad," he said, his voice over a background of laughter and music. "Just wanted to check in." "Where are you?" I asked. "Out with some friends. Listen, I might be a little late visiting this week. Work's crazy." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Sure, take care of yourself." "You too, Dad. Talk soon." Click. 91 seconds. I stared at the phone a moment longer before setting it down. The next morning during breakfast, Carla, the young aide with bright eyes and a messy bun, brought me my mail. "Bank statement for you," she said, placing the envelope beside my tray of eggs and toast. Then she added with a grin, "You must be doing pretty well. Not many folks here are still paying other people's bills." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "What did you say?" She shrugged. "Oh, I just heard someone mention it, that you still cover your kids' expenses. That's really generous." She moved on before I could answer, leaving me staring at the bank envelope like it had something to confess. Generous. That was one word for it. Another was used. That night I opened the statement. The numbers were there in black and white: mortgage payments, utility bills, car insurance, credit card transfers. Money flowing out of my account like a steady drip, even though I no longer lived under that roof, no longer drove those cars, no longer bought the things that filled those credit card statements. And for what? Weekly calls barely long enough to ask how I was. A muffin every other Sunday if their schedules allowed. The thought lodged in my chest like a stone. That Sunday they came together. Matthew in a crisp button-down, Emily in a sweater the color of ripe peaches. They brought muffins from the bakery I loved, but neither seemed inclined to linger. We sat in the lounge, the hum of the vending machine filling the gaps in conversation. "How's work?" I asked Matthew. "Busy but good. I've got a promotion coming." I smiled faintly. "Congratulations. Guess that new car of yours will feel right at home in the executive parking lot." He blinked. "Oh, you heard about that." "I saw it," I said. Emily's eyes darted between us. "It was a good deal, Dad. He deserved it." I took a bite of the muffin, chewing slowly. The blueberries tasted sweeter than I remembered, or maybe I was just noticing more. We talked about the weather, about a show they'd started watching. 10 minutes later, they stood to leave. "We'll come by next weekend," Matthew said. I watched them walk out, my gaze fixed on the door long after it closed. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted them to come back. That night sleep wouldn't come. I paced my room, the floor creaking faintly under my slippers. At midnight, I wandered into the hallway. The lights were dimmed, the building quiet except for the hum of the heating system. As I passed the lounge, I heard voices, low, urgent. "He's still paying everything," one said. A man's voice. "Yeah, and with the new car, I don't know how long." I froze, my hand resting on the door frame. "Don't push it," the first voice said. "As long as he doesn't ask questions, we're fine." I didn't recognize the voices. They weren't staff. They weren't residents I knew. I took a step closer, but the conversation ended abruptly, footsteps retreating down another hallway. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, the words replaying in my mind. "As long as he doesn't ask questions." For weeks, I had been telling myself not to jump to conclusions, that my children loved me, that they had my best interests at heart. But that night, I stopped telling myself that story. And once you stop believing the story, you start looking for the truth. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked between a coupon booklet and a pamphlet about fall prevention. Carla slid the small stack of mail onto my breakfast tray as if it were a garnish: toast, scrambled eggs, orange juice, and the envelope that would change my week. It wasn't thick or dramatic. No red stamps. Just my name, my address at the facility, and the bank's blue logo in the corner. The kind of envelope you toss on a kitchen counter, to be opened after dishes. Back when I had a kitchen counter, I ate first. I told myself that was because I didn't want cold eggs. The truth was, I wanted 10 more minutes of not knowing. When I finally slit the top open with the dull plastic knife, a small shower of paper dust fell onto the tray. The letter was short, polite, and full of warning bells. We are writing to confirm changes to your account notifications and recurring external transfers. If you did not authorize these changes, please contact us immediately. I read it twice. Changes, recurring transfers. The words sat there, ordinary in their vocabulary and extraordinary in their implication. I folded the letter in half, then unfolded it again as if something else might appear between the lines. Margaret slid into the chair across from me with a tray of oatmeal and prunes. You look like a man who just found a snake in his mailbox. I passed the letter to her without a word. She read it, her eyebrows lifting just a fraction. You call them yet? Not yet. Eat first, she said, mirroring my own hesitation, then softened. Then call. After breakfast, I took the letter back to my room and found the worn leather notebook I kept in the top drawer of the dresser. Years ago, after my wife died, I started keeping a paper log of bills and payments, the old-school engineer in me trusting ink more than clouds. Mortgage dates, utilities, insurance, asterisks, and notes in the margins. The last few months, the entries were cleaner than ever. Being here left a lot of empty hours for neat handwriting. The bank's customer service number was printed at the bottom of the letter. When I pressed it on my phone, a small robot welcomed me and asked me to press numbers that had no obvious relationship to my problem. After 3 false starts and 1 polite, "Representative, please," a woman named Teresa picked up. "Mr. Hartley," she said after verifying my birth date and the last 4 digits of everything I own. "I can see there were 2 changes last week. A new device added for mobile alerts and an external transfer scheduled on the 15th of each month to an account ending in 2047. Would you like me to read the account holder's name for the external transfer?" I felt my breath snag in my throat. "Yes," I said, steadying my voice. "Please, holder Matthew Hartley." There was a long pause on my end. I realized it only when Teresa said softly, "Sir." "I'm here," I said. "And the device?" "An iPhone 14, last login yesterday 6:22 p.m. IP address. I can't share the full address, but the location is designated as home address on file." My home address on file was still the house where my son now parked his new car. I did not authorize those changes. I said, the words tasting metallic. And I did not set up a recurring transfer. "All right," Teresa said, suddenly all business and care. "We'll freeze new external transfers immediately and remove the device from the alert list. I can also place fraud monitoring on the account and schedule an appointment with a banker at your nearest branch to review recent transactions and reset your security. Do you have capacity to visit a branch?" Capacity. The word made me want to laugh. "Yes," I said. "I can visit. We can do tomorrow, 10 a.m., Maple Street branch. Bring a photo ID. I'll add a note so the banker is prepared to walk you through everything. Is there anything else you'd like to check now?" "Yes," I said. "Could you read me any large withdrawals in the last 60 days? Her keyboard clicked softly through the phone. "There are 3 that stand out. A cashier's check for $18,500 made out to Hawthorne Luxury Motors on the 12th. A transfer for $3,200 to the same external account ending in 2047 on the 15th. And a $2,750 charge coded as home improvements, home front interiors. Hawthorne Luxury Motors." I said the name out loud and felt the room tilt, just slightly. "Thank you," I said, because politeness had kept me intact for most of my life, and I wasn't sure what would remain if I let it go. When I hung up, the quiet in the room felt different, not heavy, sharp, like air after lightning. At lunch, Margaret watched me push peas around my plate. "Well," she asked, "tomorrow, the bank, want company. I think I should go alone." I paused. "But would you mind if I told you afterward?" "Please do," she said, and gave my wrist a squeeze that felt steadier than the floor. That afternoon, I walked the garden path outside, a careful rectangle bounded by clipped hedges and obedient tulips. I had mocked it in my mind for being too tidy. Today, the neatness calmed me. Control wasn't the enemy. Misuse was. On the bench by the maple, I took out the pocket watch and wound it twice. My father used to say the ritual mattered more than the timekeeping. The winding told the watch it was still wanted. I thought about rituals, Sunday dinners, phone calls, paying bills. How some rituals kept families close. How others made it easier to take without asking. As the sun thinned to evening, I caught my reflection faintly in the lounge window. A man in his 60s, shoulders squared by habit, mouth set like a door someone had forgotten to oil. I hardly recognized him, and then, suddenly, I did. He was the version of me from the years when the roof leaked and there was no money for a roofer. The man who climbed the ladder anyway, hands raw, because living meant fixing what was yours to fix. The next morning, Linda arranged for the facility van to take me to the bank. "We can drop you at the Maple Street branch and pick you up at noon," she said. "Do you need anyone to go in with you?" "No," I said, "but thank you." The branch smelled like new carpet and old money. A young man in a blue tie met me at the door. His name tag said Alex Banker. He had the brisk competence of someone who believed in systems. He also had the eyes of someone who had seen those systems fail people. "Mr. Hartley, we've set aside a private room." He offered his hand. "Can I get you coffee or water?" "Water, please." In the small glassed-in office, Alex logged into a terminal and pulled up my accounts. He explained each step, as if narration could make it less invasive. "We'll review the last 90 days, then we can reset your online credentials and add a verbal password to your profile. If you suspect someone close to you has access, we can also lock down in-branch transactions to require your physical presence." He turned the monitor slightly so I could see. There they were. The cashier's check to Hawthorne Luxury Motors with a memo line that read simply, "Vehicle." The $3,200 monthly transfer to the external account ending in 2047, and the $2,750 to Home Front Interiors a week before I moved to the facility. "Can you pull up the authorization method on the cashier's check?" I asked. My voice was even. I had lived a lifetime teaching myself that volume wasn't strength. Alex clicked another screen. The check was requested in person at our High Ridge branch. Signature on file here. He turned a printout toward me. The signature was mine. My name, the tilt of the H, the tight loop in the Y. Except it wasn't the way I sign in a hurry. It was the way I sign when I'm trying to make it legible for a clerk who will squint. Deliberate, too deliberate. "Do you remember visiting that branch on the 12th? Alex asked carefully. "No," I said. "I was here." I handed him the admission bracelet the facility had put on my wrist the day I moved in and never bothered to cut off. "And I don't drive anymore." He studied the bracelet, then the signature, then me. "We can request security footage from the branch for that day," he said. "It'll take a formal request through our fraud department, but I can start it now. If the footage shows a person who is not you, this gets very straightforward. If it shows you, but it isn't you, we still have options. Either way, the recurring external transfer is already suspended." "And the device added to my alerts?" I asked. "Removed. I recommend we set up app-based authentication on your phone only and add a verbal passphrase. Something that isn't easily guessed." "My father's pocket watch," I said, reflex more than choice. He smiled. "I'd advise against anything connected to family history. Try something random, 4 unrelated words, like maple anchor teacup radio." I repeated it. It felt like a small raft, ridiculous and afloat. "Mr. Hartley," Alex said, folding his hands, "I'm going to ask a question I ask in cases like this. Do your children have your account credentials?" "No," I said. Then, because honesty was a reflex drilled too deep to suppress, not that I knowingly gave. He nodded, understood. He typed a note, then looked up. "If someone in your family is accessing funds without your permission, it's a kind of betrayal that's uniquely painful. I see it more often than I'd like. You're not alone in being a good person who assumed good intentions." I stared at the printout again, my name staring back in a shape I recognized and did not. "What happens next?" "I file the internal report today. Fraud will contact you within 48 hours. The security footage request goes out now. In the meantime, I recommend you change your online banking user ID and password, and I can help you open a new checking account. We can route your pension into the new account and leave the old one under watch, with no outgoing transfers permitted. Do it, I said, and surprised myself with how quickly it came. He printed 2 forms. I signed them, my hand steady now. I watched my own signature, faster, familiar, cross the page. It felt like reclaiming something small and essential, like my name had been out at sea, and I had just pulled it back over the gunwale. When the facility van picked me up, the driver was humming an old Motown melody. Outside the window, the town streamed by, unchanged and newly strange. The bakery was putting out fresh bread. A boy on a scooter raced a gust of wind. I wondered if Matthew had ever noticed the way the maple trees along the avenue all leaned slightly east from years of prevailing wind. I wondered if he would notice anything I changed today. Back in my room, I called the number on the letter again to confirm the changes. Then I called the facility's front desk. "Could you print a copy of any record that shows I was here on the 12th? I asked Linda. "A sign-in sheet, medical note, anything with a timestamp." "Of course," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I lied. I set the papers from the bank on the table and arranged them in a neat fan: cashier's check, external transfer, home improvements. It wasn't a puzzle with thousands of pieces. It was 3 pieces, large and obvious. You could solve it from across the room. Margaret knocked, then peeked in. "Do I pass inspection?" she asked, and stepped inside when I gestured her in. I walked her through the morning. When I finished, she sat very still, then nodded once in a way that contained both sadness and approval. "So now you know what the quiet was trying to tell you," she said. "I don't know what to do with the anger," I admitted. "It doesn't feel like me." "Maybe it is you," she said gently. "The part that protects you, the part that remembers your name." We sat a while without talking. The afternoon light moved across the floor like a slow tide. At some point, Earl wandered by the open door, glanced in, and gave a small salute as if to say he had no advice but was rooting for my campaign. At dinner, the chicken was dry and the peas were mush, and none of it mattered. I was busy deciding whether to call my children that night or wait. The old habits argued for a soft approach. Start a conversation, ask questions, give them a chance to explain. The sharper air suggested something else. Control the valves first, then ask. I opted for the valves. After dinner, I logged into my pension portal and updated the direct deposit to the new account Alex had opened. I checked the utilities for the house, electric, water, gas, and confirmed they were still paid out of my old checking account. I set them to end on the last day of the month. The internet, the streaming, the alarm system, they too would go dark. Each change required a confirmation code sent to my phone, each confirmation a small click in my chest like a lock turning. When the last one was done, I stared at the phone a long time. Then I called Matthew. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "I met with the bank today," I said. "We found some oddities. A cashier's check to a car dealership, a recurring transfer to your account, a device added to my alerts." There was a beat of silence, then a controlled exhale. "Dad, I can explain. I'd like you to." I kept my voice even. "But I should tell you I've already stopped the transfers and closed the old account to outgoing payments. Utilities for the house will end at the month. We can talk about what should happen next after I have the bank's footage and the fraud department's report." "Dad," his voice cracked just slightly, then leveled. "You don't understand how much I've been juggling. The house needs work. Emily needed help. I figured." He stopped, then shifted into a tone I recognized from when he was 12 and wanted to go to a party I'd already said no to. "It's not what you think." "I hope not," I said, "but I'll wait for the facts to tell me." He went quiet for a long moment. "Can we come by tomorrow?" "You can," I said. "10 a.m. if you come willing to be honest." When I hung up, I expected to shake. I didn't. I felt intact, like a beam that had creaked for years and finally settled into its proper place. Anger was still there, but it had a form now, And when anger has a form, it can be carried without spilling. That night, I slept more deeply than I had since arriving. I dreamed of the house, but not as a museum I had been removed from. In the dream, I was in the yard, pulling out a dead shrub. The soil was stubborn, clinging to roots that didn't want to let go. I dug my fingers in, felt the give, and eased the root up whole. When I looked up, the garden was enormous, wild, generous, and the path through it was mine to choose. In the morning, I found Ruth in the sunroom, her hands steady around a cup of tea. "You look taller today," she said. "I changed a few things," I answered. She nodded toward the window. "It's amazing what light does when you move one curtain." I sat with her, the two of us watching the sky. A few wisps of cloud were streaked the delicate pink of an old scar healing. The day would hold its share of hard conversations, but the light was honest. Before 10, Linda brought up a thin printout she'd pulled from the digital logs. Resident Hartley, admitted and wristbanded. Vitals taken 10:13 a.m. Feb. 12. The date of the cashier's check, time-stamped. I slipped it into my leather notebook. At 9:58, footsteps came down the hall, 2 sets, quick and familiar. I stood, placed the notebook on the table, and breathed once, slow and deep. There are moments in a father's life when love is giving. There are others when love is refusing to be used. I opened the door. "Come in," I said. "Let's start with the truth." And from somewhere, the watch in my pocket ticked loudly enough for all of us to hear. The knock on my door came exactly at 10. Not a minute earlier, not a minute late. I'd always raised my children to value punctuality, but in this moment, it felt less like respect and more like strategy. Arriving on time meant no one could accuse you of avoiding the hard thing. Matthew stepped in first, his shirt neatly pressed, the faint smell of cologne following him like an announcement. Emily came right behind him, her sweater a soft beige that made her seem almost faded against the white walls. "Dad," Matthew began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're here just like we said." "Come in," I said, gesturing to the 2 chairs across from my small table. The leather notebook lay between us like a referee. Emily sat carefully, crossing her ankles. Matthew leaned back, one arm draped over the chair, trying to project ease. I stayed standing for a moment longer, just long enough for the silence to stretch. Then I sat. "I spoke with the bank," I said, my voice level. "We confirmed several transactions I did not authorize. A cashier's check to Hawthorne Luxury Motors, recurring transfers to your account, Matthew, a home improvement charge just before I moved here, and a new device added to my alerts logged in from the house." Emily's eyes flicked to Matthew. He didn't look at her. "Dad, you have to understand," Matthew said. "The house needs work, repairs you didn't get to before moving. The car was $18,500, I cut in, paid for with my signature, forged at the High Ridge branch on February 12th. On that date, I was here." I slid the facility's admission log toward him. Wristband, vitals, timestamp. Matthew didn't touch the paper. "It's not like I took it to hurt you. I was just managing things. You're comfortable here, you don't need." Comfortable. The word came out sharper than I intended. "Do you think comfort erases betrayal?" Emily's voice, small but firm, slipped into the space between us. "Dad, we didn't mean to make you feel unwanted. We thought. You thought I'd keep paying without asking. You thought distance would make me quieter. You thought wrong." The room went still. Even the hallway beyond the door seemed to hush. Matthew leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I handled the finances because I thought it was best. Maybe I messed up, but I didn't think you'd see it as stealing. When you take what isn't yours without asking," I said, "there's only one word for it." His jaw tightened. "We're family." "That used to mean something," I said. Emily's eyes glossed, and for a moment she looked 12 again, the day her mother died, when she clung to my arm like it was the only thing holding her up. "Can we fix this?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked, and saw both the child she'd been and the woman who had stood silent while her brother drained my accounts. "Maybe," I said, "but fixing starts with truth." Matthew's gaze dropped. "I set up the transfer, the car. I wanted something nice. I figured it was okay because you'd always said you wanted us to live well. I didn't think about how it looked." And the home improvements. He hesitated. Emily spoke. I picked out furniture. Thought you'd like the house to feel fresh, but I guess that was for us more than for you. For you, I said, letting the words land. No one spoke for a while. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and deliberate like my pocket watch in my coat. I've already stopped every payment that leaves my account for the house, I said. The utilities end this month. The mortgage, if you want to keep the house, you'll need to cover it. If you sell it, that's your choice. But you won't use my name or my credit again. Matthew opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What about? I'm keeping my pension for myself, I said, and I'll decide where it goes. If I help either of you again, it will be because I choose to, not because I'm being siphoned without knowing. Emily's tears spilled over. We should have talked to you. Yes, I said, you should have. Matthew's hands clenched into fists on his knees. I guess this is it then. It depends, I said, on whether you want a relationship with me that isn't about money. Neither answered. That told me enough for now. I stood. I think we're done for today. They rose slowly, the scrape of chairs loud in the quiet room. Emily lingered at the door. Dad, we do love you. Love without respect, I said, is just sentiment. When they left, I sat back down, the notebook still on the table. I opened it and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Under it I wrote, "The truth was smaller than I imagined and heavier than I wanted." Through the window, I saw them cross the parking lot together, their heads bent toward each other. I didn't know if they were talking about me or about lunch plans. Either way, I didn't follow them with my eyes for long. The day outside was cold, but the sky was clear, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without waiting for the phone to ring. The morning after our conversation, I woke earlier than usual. The air in my room felt lighter, the way a house does after you've finally opened a window that's been stuck for months. The clock on the wall said 5:42, but my mind was already busy, running through the list I'd made before bed. The notebook sat open on the table, a page headed to due. Underneath, confirm all utility cancellations. Remove house from my insurance policy. Reroute pension to new account. Freeze old checking account. Contact credit bureau, lock credit file. I started with the easiest. By 7:00 a.m., I was on the phone with the electric company. The woman on the line read my account number, my service address, my name. Yes, end of service date confirmed, February 28. The gas company was next. Then water. Then internet. Each time, the representative offered to transfer the account to another name to avoid disconnection. Each time I declined. By 9:15, the house I'd paid for, still filled with their voices, their furniture, their easy assumption that I would keep the roof steady, was financially mine in name only. At 10:00, I called my insurance agent. Remove the property on Ashford Lane from my policy, I said. I'm no longer responsible for it. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone knows they're hearing the end of a story. After lunch, I called the credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, and placed a lock on my file. No one could open a new account in my name without my say-so now. By mid-afternoon, the list was complete. Each task crossed out felt like pulling another root from soil that had been strangling me. I sat back in my chair and stared at the notebook. It wasn't pride I felt. Not yet. It was more like reclaiming a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd let go. At 3:47, my phone rang. Matthew, I almost didn't pick up. What did you do? His voice was tight, sharp. I made sure my finances are in my hands, I said. The utilities are off after this month. Insurance is gone. Do you have any idea what that means for the house? It means you have decisions to make, I said evenly. Dad, this is Patty. You can't just. I can, I said, and I did. There was a pause, then a low exhale. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I almost laughed. Harder for who? He didn't answer. The line went dead a few seconds later. Emily called that evening. Her voice was softer, almost pleading. Dad, you've made your point, but can we talk about easing into this? Maybe keep the internet on until we figure things out. I'm done funding what I'm not part of, I said. This isn't punishment, it's clarity. You don't have to do this. Yes, I said quietly, I do. When the call ended, I expected the guilt to come the way it always had when I denied them something. But it didn't. Instead, there was a strange calm, as if the balance of my life had shifted back toward its center. Over the next few days, the reactions came in waves. A curt text from Matthew, guess we know where we stand. Silence from Emily, broken by a single message 3 days later. I didn't think it would come to this. Margaret noticed the change in me. You're walking straighter, she said one morning over oatmeal. Feels like I'm walking in my own shoes again, I replied. You'll need that, she said. They won't give up trying to turn the tap back on. She was right. On Friday, Matthew showed up at the facility. No muffins this time. He asked to see me privately in the garden. You've made your point, he said without preamble. You can turn the utilities back on now. I'm not turning anything back on, I said. If you want the house, pay for it. If you don't, sell it. His jaw tightened. You're going to regret this. No, I said. I regret letting it go on this long. He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head and walked away. I didn't watch him leave. That night, I wrote in my notebook, sometimes love isn't giving more. Sometimes it's giving nothing at all until respect comes back. The words felt final, but I knew they weren't the end. This was only the moment the current stopped. The real storm would come when they realized I wasn't turning it back on. The letter from the bank's fraud department arrived on a Monday morning. Unlike the one that first warned me, this one was thick, multiple pages, each carrying the weight of official language. I took it to the sunroom, where the light was good and the air smelled faintly of the lavender plant Ruth had convinced the staff to keep by the window. Inside was everything I'd been waiting for. Confirmation that the cashier's check to Hawthorne Luxury Motors was unauthorized, that the recurring transfers to Matthew's account were initiated from a device not registered to me, and most damning of all, a still image captured from the bank's High Ridge branch security footage. It was Matthew. He stood at the counter in a tailored jacket, signing my name with practiced ease. His hand curved exactly as mine would, the tilt of the letters precise. Anyone who didn't know me might have believed it, but I knew the small differences, the way I loop my T when I'm thinking, the quick flourish I give my Y when I'm tired. His version was careful, too careful. I stared at that image for a long time before picking up my notebook. Under the date, I wrote, "Theft wears the face you love most." That afternoon, I called Alex at the bank. They confirmed it, I said. "I've read the report," he replied. "It's strong. If you want to take legal action, this will carry weight." "I do," I said, and the steadiness in my voice surprised me. The next day I met with a lawyer named Caroline Ames. She had the kind of handshake that said she'd been underestimated more than once and learned to like it. Her office smelled of paper and rain. I handed her the folder, bank reports, transaction histories, facility logs proving I was here on the day of the check, and the security photo. She flipped through each page slowly, her pen tapping against her legal pad. "This is clear-cut," she said finally. "Forgery, unauthorized access to financial accounts, possibly elder financial abuse depending on how the court frames it." The word elder stung, but I let it pass. She leaned forward. "You should know this will be messy. Family cases always are. Are you prepared for them to deny everything, for them to try to paint this as a misunderstanding?" "They already have," I said. "Then you'll need to decide how far you want this to go. Criminal charges are possible. So is a civil suit for damages. We can start with a demand letter, give them the chance to return the funds and sign an agreement not to access your accounts again. And if they refuse, we escalate." 2 weeks later, the demand letter went out. It was short, factual, without drama. The bank's findings were attached. It gave Matthew 10 business days to respond, return the money, and agree to conditions. On the 7th day, Emily called. "Dad, we got the letter," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't be serious about court." "I am," I said. "This will ruin Matt's career." "Matt made choices," I said, "and those choices have consequences. You're our father, you're supposed to protect us." "I am," I said quietly, "by not letting you think you can do this to anyone else." On the 10th day, there was no payment, no agreement. Caroline filed the case. Within a month, we were in the courthouse, me in a navy jacket that still fit well enough, Matthew in a suit a shade too sharp for the occasion. Emily sat behind him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge listened to Caroline's presentation, the bank's witness, and the facility staff who confirmed my whereabouts. When the security footage was played, the room went very still. Matthew didn't look at me. When it was his turn, his lawyer tried to frame it as a family misunderstanding, that I had implicitly given him permission, that I'd always paid for the house, the car, the bills, and that this was a continuation of that pattern. Caroline rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Hartley," she said to Matthew, "can you explain why you needed to sign your father's name if you believed you had permission?" Matthew shifted in his seat. It was easier than explaining to the bank. "So you forged it?" He hesitated. "I signed it. With your father's name?" "Yes, that's forgery." His lawyer objected. The judge overruled. The decision came 3 weeks later. Restitution of the stolen funds, legal fees covered, and a formal order restricting Matthew and Emily from accessing my accounts or acting on my behalf without written consent. When the ruling was read, I felt no triumph. Just the quiet satisfaction of a door closing on a room I didn't need to walk into again. Outside the courthouse, Emily approached me. "Dad, I hope you both learn from this," I said, my voice calm. "But I'm done teaching that lesson the hard way." I turned and walked toward Caroline's car. Behind me, I heard Matthew's voice, low and strained, but I didn't turn back. That night, back in my room at the facility, I sat by the window and opened my notebook. I wrote, "Justice isn't revenge. It's the boundary that lets you keep loving yourself." The sky outside was a deep blue, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel like it was pressing down on me. It felt wide open. It was 3 days after the ruling when I saw them again. The facility's front desk called to say I had visitors. For a moment, I thought about saying I wasn't available, but avoidance was just another way of letting things rot in the dark. I waited for them in the small lounge off the main hallway. The chairs were arranged in a circle, the kind meant for group activities, but today they made the space feel like an arena. The late afternoon sun was coming in at a low angle, dust motes drifting like tiny, indifferent witnesses. Matthew walked in first. He looked different, tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. Emily followed, carrying a paper bag. She placed it on the table between us. "Muffins," she said, as if the offering might unlock something. "Thank you," I said, not reaching for them. They both sat. No one spoke for a while. The hum of the vending machine down the hall filled the gap. Matthew cleared his throat. "Dad, I wanted to acknowledge what happened. I know you don't believe me, but I didn't set out to hurt you. I was thinking about keeping things going." "Things?" I asked. "The house, the image. You've always been the one holding it all together. I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I thought I could step in without bothering you." "You thought wrong," I said. Emily leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "We should have talked to you. I should have spoken up sooner. I saw things that didn't feel right, but I told myself it was family, and family handles things quietly." "Silence isn't handling," I said. Her voice cracked. "I know." I looked at them both. "The court order protects my finances, but it can't repair trust. That's on us if we want it." Matthew's eyes flicked to mine. "Do you?" "I want a relationship," I said slowly, "but not the one we had. Not one where I'm the provider and you're the beneficiaries. If we talk, it won't be about bills or transfers or whose name is on what. It'll be about life. Yours, mine, and maybe over time we can meet in the middle again." Emily nodded quickly as if afraid the offer might vanish. Matthew's jaw worked, but he didn't argue. "I'm not promising," I added. "I'm saying there's a chance if you choose it, but it starts with honesty, and it starts now." Matthew leaned back, exhaling. "I can try. That's all I'll ask for today," I said. We sat for a while longer, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, the muffins, a neighbor from the old street who had moved away. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it wasn't war either. When they left, Emily hugged me. Matthew shook my hand. Both gestures felt like they came from people learning a new language, still struggling with pronunciation. Back in my room, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Sometimes the last dialogue isn't an ending. It's a truce. 2 weeks after our last conversation, I realized there was still a drip I hadn't sealed. It came in the form of a property tax notice addressed to me but sent to the house. Linda at the front desk slid the envelope across the counter with a puzzled look. "This came in your mail batch," she said. I opened it right there. The balance due wasn't much compared to what had been taken before, but it was in my name. My responsibility, my liability. That ended today. I called the county tax office and explained that I no longer resided at the property. The woman on the line took my information, her keystrokes rapid. "We'll remove your name from the account as soon as the new owner or responsible party is confirmed," she said. Responsible party, I repeated after hanging up. The phrase tasted cleaner than I expected. That afternoon, I logged into my bank account. The new one, the one only I had access to. The balance reflected exactly what I'd planned: pension deposits, small withdrawals for personal expenses, and nothing else. I clicked through every possible menu, every tab. There were no linked accounts, no scheduled transfers, no hidden permissions. For the first time in months, the numbers on the screen felt like mine. I took it further. I closed the old savings account I'd left open just in case. I updated every subscription, phone, insurance, even the newspaper, to bill directly to my new account. I called the mortgage lender and removed my name from any co-signer responsibilities. By the end of the week, there wasn't a single bill, service, or loan that tied me financially to Matthew or Emily. Not one. The calls started on Saturday. First, Emily. "Dad, I got a notice about the mortgage. They're saying you're not on it anymore. Is that true?" "Yes," I said. "But what if something happens? What if?" "What happens is your responsibility now," I said gently. "Not mine." Silence, then a sigh. "I guess I understand." Matthew was less diplomatic. "You really went all the way, didn't you?" he said. "All the way," I replied. "This is your way of cutting us off for good." "This is my way of making sure my money stays mine," I said, "and of making sure you stand on your own feet. You think this is going to teach me something?" "I hope so," I said. "But that's up to you." He hung up without another word. I expected to feel triumphant. What I felt instead was stillness. It was like finally setting down a heavy box you've been carrying too far. Your arms remember the weight for a while, but eventually they just feel lighter. That night I sat with Margaret in the garden. The air smelled faintly of cut grass. "You've got that look again," she said. "What look?" "The one where you've finally done the thing you were afraid to do, and now you don't know what to do with the space it left." She was right. Without the constant drain, without the worry, my life felt open. And in that openness, an idea began to take shape. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew this much. I didn't want to spend the rest of my days counting what I'd lost. I wanted to build something new with what I had left. The next morning, I opened my notebook and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Plan." Underneath, the first line, "Do something good with the money they can't take." I didn't know yet that this plan would lead to something bigger, a seed for the next chapter of my life. But the moment the pen touched paper, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding on. I was moving forward. It started with a conversation over tea. Margaret and I were sitting in the sunroom, the late morning light pooling on the floor like honey. She was telling me about her neighbor from years ago, an elderly man who'd lost his savings to a scam disguised as a home repair company. "He never told anyone until it was too late," she said, shaking her head. "Said he didn't want to be a burden." I thought about that phrase, a burden. How many of us carry it like a shadow, hiding what's being taken from us because we're afraid it will make us look weak. I thought about the months I'd stayed quiet, about the money siphoned away while I kept telling myself that family loyalty was worth the cost. And then I thought, what if there was a place people could go before it was too late? That afternoon, I sat at my small desk and opened my notebook. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote one word: center. Under it, I began listing what it could be: a place where seniors could get free financial checkups, lawyers willing to offer consultations, volunteers to teach online safety and money management, a network to respond quickly when someone's at risk. By the time dinner rolled around, I had 3 pages of ideas and the beginnings of something that felt bigger than me, but in the best way. The next morning, I called Caroline, my lawyer. "I want to start something," I said. "What kind of something?" "A place to help people like me, people being taken advantage of financially, especially by those they trust. I don't know if it's a non-profit, a program, or just a table at the library with pamphlets, but I want to do it." She was quiet for a moment. "You know, most of my clients in situations like yours just want to move on and never think about it again." "I tried that," I said. "It didn't sit right." "All right," she said. "First step, choose a structure. Second, get a name, and you'll need seed money." "I have seed money," I said, thinking of the balance in my new account, the one no one could touch but me. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with Caroline twice and a retired accountant named Peter, who had been introduced to me by Earl. Peter had a habit of tapping his pen against his notebook 3 times before speaking, as if blessing his thoughts. "You want to call it what?" he asked when I floated my first idea. "The Hartley Center," I said. He nodded slowly. "Has weight to it. People remember names more than acronyms." We filed the paperwork to register it as a non-profit. Caroline connected me with a few community groups that already worked with seniors. I started attending their meetings, listening more than talking. The more I listened, the more I realized my story wasn't unusual. A widow whose son had drained her retirement to pay gambling debts. A grandfather whose daughter used his credit cards for years without telling him. A man in his 70s whose own brother had taken out loans in his name. Each story had the same refrain: "I didn't think it could happen to me." One Saturday, the facility let me use the common room for an open session. I printed a flyer: "Protecting your finances, stories, advice, and support." Margaret and Ruth helped set out chairs. Earl brought in a thermos of coffee so strong it could have been used to clean the floors. I expected maybe 6 people. We got 20. We went around the circle, each person sharing a little of their story or their fear. Some had already been victims. Others just wanted to know how to keep it from happening. I told them about the bank letter, the forged check, the day I decided enough was enough. When the session ended, a woman named Leela came up to me. "You should do this every month," she said. "People need a place to talk before they are in crisis." I wrote it down in my notebook that night. Monthly sessions, yes. The weeks began to take on a new rhythm. I'd spend mornings at the facility, afternoons making calls, sending emails, and sketching out the center's services. Caroline helped me secure a small grant from a local foundation. Peter found us an unused office above a community center, 1 room, 2 desks, and a window that looked out over the park. When I stood in that empty room for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, purpose that wasn't tied to someone else's approval. One evening, as I was packing up my notes, Emily called. "I heard about what you're doing," she said. "From who?" "Does it matter? I think it's good, Dad, really good." There was a pause, and in it I thought I heard the faintest trace of pride. "Thank you," I said. We didn't talk about the past, not that night, but it felt like a door, small maybe, had cracked open. Back in my room, I opened my notebook and wrote, "A new beginning isn't about erasing what happened. It's about building something that makes what happened worth surviving." I didn't know exactly where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt like mine to walk. By the end of the first month, the Hartley Center had a phone line, a mailbox, and a small sign in the window: "Financial safety for seniors, free and confidential." It wasn't much, but every time I walked up the stairs to our rented office, the sight of that sign steadied something in me. Peter and I split our time between paperwork and the real work, listening. People came in with thick envelopes of statements, with suspicious letters, with a feeling in their gut they couldn't quite name. Sometimes we confirmed their fears, other times we sent them home with peace of mind. Both were victories. The first case we helped involved a widower named Henry. His niece had convinced him to co-sign a loan just until her next paycheck. But the loan had ballooned into thousands of dollars in unpaid debt. We walked him through the process of freezing his credit, disputing unauthorized charges, and setting up direct alerts. When he left, he gripped my hand. "I thought I was just getting old," he said. "Turns out I was just getting taken." 2 weeks later, a reporter from the Maple County Gazette came by. She'd heard about our open sessions from one of her readers. She asked for an interview, and I agreed, mostly because she seemed genuinely interested in the problem, not just the headline. We sat in the park across from the office. I told her about the bank letter, the forged check, the court case, not naming names but not softening the truth. When the article ran the following Sunday, my phone rang nonstop. Some were calls for help. Others were from people who just wanted to say they'd been there too. One call was from Emily. "I saw the article," she said. "What did you think?" "I think it makes you sound brave, and I guess you are." Her voice had a softness I hadn't heard in years. We didn't dive into our own history, but I could feel her inching closer to a kind of understanding. Matthew's reaction came secondhand. Margaret told me she'd run into his old friend at the grocery store. "He says Matt's been quiet lately," she said. "Didn't like seeing the story in print, but maybe that means it got to him." I didn't expect him to call, and he didn't. But 2 days later, a small envelope arrived at the office with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $500 made out to the Hartley Center. In the memo line, "For good use." I knew his handwriting. The center began to take root in the community. Our monthly sessions grew to 30, then 40 people. We started a newsletter with simple tips: how to spot a scam, how to protect passwords, how to talk to family about money without fear. One afternoon, a woman named Clara came in clutching a crumpled flyer. She'd seen it posted at the bus stop. "My grandson's been using my credit card," she admitted, eyes wet. I didn't want to believe it, but I need help. We helped her file the reports, cancel the card, and set up a new account. When she left, she hugged me tightly. "You're giving people like me a fighting chance," she said. That night, I sat in my room at the facility, the notebook open in my lap. I wrote, "A seed doesn't know how big it will grow. It just takes root where it can and trusts the sun will find it." The Hartley Center was still small, but it was alive. And so was I. In a way, I hadn't been for years. Winter had settled over Maple County, softening the edges of everything. The park outside the Hartley Center was bare, the benches dusted with frost. Inside, our little office was warm, buzzing with the low hum of the heater and the shuffle of papers as Peter and I prepared for the year's final open session. We had 50 chairs set out now. 50. I thought back to the first meeting. 20 strangers in a nursing home common room, and marveled at how something so small had grown without me even noticing each step. At the end of the session, people lingered, sipping coffee, sharing stories. I stayed near the back, letting them talk to each other. The center had become more than a service. It was a place where no one had to pretend they weren't struggling. That afternoon, Emily came to see me. She stepped into the office, her cheeks pink from the cold, holding a tin of cookies. "I thought you could use these for the volunteers," she said. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. We sat in the little meeting room, steam rising from our mugs of tea. For a while we talked about nothing, weather, her work, a book she was reading. Then she looked down at her hands and said, "Dad, I'm sorry for all of it. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have been better." I let the silence hold us for a moment. "It hurt," I said, "but hearing you say that matters." Her eyes met mine. "I want to earn your trust back." "You can start," I said, "by helping here. We could use someone to organize the newsletter." She smiled faintly. "I can do that." A week later, a small envelope arrived at the center. No name, just a return address I recognized. Inside was a check for $1,000 made out to the Hartley Center. The handwriting was the same as the one on the $500 donation months ago. No note, no phone call, just the check. It was Matthew's way of speaking, and for now it was enough. On the last day of the year, I sat by the window in my room at the facility, notebook in hand. I thought about the man I had been 12 months ago, quiet, worn down, carrying weight that wasn't mine to carry. And I thought about the man I was now, still carrying some things, yes, but choosing what stayed in my hands. I wrote, saying no isn't closing the door on love. It's closing the door on harm so love has a place to grow. To anyone listening now, I want to say this. Your worth doesn't depend on how much you give away. Protecting what's yours, your time, your money, your peace, isn't selfish. It's how you make sure you have something left to give that comes from love, not obligation. Thank you for walking with me through this story. I wish you health, peace, and the kind of love that stands on respect. Hold your boundaries, cherish your days, and never forget, you are allowed to keep what you've worked for, and you are allowed to use it to build something beautiful.